Uh, Good evening, everybody. Um, I, I'm, I'm conscious that people have busy lives, so I think we are going to start the film very shortly. I'm just going to say a few comments about it. My name is Joan Porter McKeever. I'm the Vice Chair of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, which is the Gertrude Bell Memorial, in case you hadn't seen that on your invite. And we are doing this in conjunction with the Harvard Club. I was also very involved with the Harvard Club and with the Emmanuel Society, and we have Sarah Vandell here of Emmanuel and quite a few people. And I also would like to thank all the members of the general public who are attending tonight, because we really appreciate the support. This film I have seen more than 24 times, so you might think it's a good film, and I hope you will all, if you, hands up who's seen the film already. So that's what I'm about to tell you. It's 90 minutes, which is why I'm starting now. How old? Well, I'm about to tell you. So the creation of the film was started in 2012, and I met the directors, but the film was not created then. Yes, you may have seen it. The first private screening in London was here in this same room. Can I make it louder? Is that better? Thank you. I appreciate that very much. So I'm not going to talk too much, because really it's the film. I'm not going to tell you all about Gertrude Bell. For those of you who don't know much about her, the film itself will speak for itself. But one of the main things to say is that this film has been a passionate creation of the two women you see up there, Ziva Olbaum and Sabine Khayenbühl. And they were directors of other films. They had done another film together on somebody called Ruth Gruber. And the reason that they created this film is they met Ruth Gruber and they all started talking about a particular book. And I don't know how many of you have read the Janet Wallach book, Queen of the Desert, but that was the book that actually inspired the making of this film. There are many books written about Gertrude Bell. She's actually a very interesting person. Some of the books I would recommend and some I would not. And the one, Janet Wallach books, is really a tremendous book, if you have a chance to read it. Tonight's screening came about because the film is available on DVD. If you see it, you might actually decide to go out and buy your own DVD. We're very lucky they're letting us screen it as a gift to the BISI for the purpose of this semi-fundraising event, which is for our Visiting Scholars program. We have our Visiting Scholars coordinator in the room as well. We've had 8 scholars in the last, or chosen the last year and a half. Those are Iraqis who come here. When you see this film, you will realize that Gertrude Bell's part in life later on was her love of Iraq. Now, she is a controversial person. There might be people in this room when we have questions that might show both sides of the equation. We'll wait for the Q&A. But I just wanted to say that 2 years ago, I had my Oscar moment when I collected a film award for them, and I have to read this off because I can't even get the title. It was the Focal Award for Best Use of Footage in a Historical Feature, and this is the National Federation of Archive Documentaries. And I can tell you, when I went to this award, it was quite exciting, because all the other documentaries were tremendous, and this won one of the prestigious awards. In 2016, as I say, we had the private screening here, and those involved in documentaries know that you have to go through the whole process of all the various film screenings, and it was in Beirut, it was in Haifa, it was in Amsterdam, it was in Berlin. So they couldn't show it for a whole year, and in 2017, they started the commercial showing, and the first one in London was at the Institute of Historical Research, organized with Caroline Barron, who also has a special bit in the film, because, am I allowed to say, her grandfather is David Hogarth, and so we're very honored to have her here tonight. I'm not going to say anything more. Afterwards, if you do not want to stay for the Q&A because you're busy, will not feel at all offended if people step out. I will be happy to answer film questions about the processing and making of the film, but also about Gertrude Bell. Okay. This film could have been 3 hours longer, 4 hours longer. They had thousands of hours of footage. I mean, it's incredible. A couple of times I say, well, why didn't you include this? And they would say, we couldn't get it all in. But I hope you all agree that they did get an awful lot in. Now, this is Q&A. But there are two things I want to say about the film. Is they didn't really know what they were getting into when they started, and I actually think if they did, they probably wouldn't have done it. They spent 6 years of their lives. There's no way that they ever made the money back that they had put into this film. They've had grants, did a lot of fundraising, but I know that this film changed their lives, and now they're working on a new film on quite an interesting American dancer who spent time in Paris. But if you have a sense of how many people knew a lot about Gertrude Bell beforehand? Okay. How many, and don't be embarrassed if you don't, how many people really didn't know anything about Gertrude Bell? Okay. So the book, and I am going to answer questions, but when she refers, Mrs. Van Ness, to the book that doesn't refer to Gertrude Bell, some of you may have heard of Glub Pasha, who also worked for King Hussein, and he started his career actually working as a young soldier on the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Of course, it wasn't Saudi Arabia yet. And he was there helping monitor the problems with the tribesmen from Ibn Saud. He wrote a book, Britain and the Arabs, 1918 to 1958. It's a huge book. She's not mentioned once. Now, this is why they did this film, because she was written out of history. For those of us, and quite a few in this room, have been involved in the Middle East, we would all know about Gertrude Bell. I grew up in the Middle East. I actually worked, my cousin worked on the Gertrude Bell archive, so I felt her letters physically. But when I meet people who haven't known about her, I can't believe it, but that's why they did this film. So now I'm going to leave it to people to ask some questions. If anybody wants to leave, feel free. There is a reception with wine, so you might want to also ask questions outside. But please, you can ask about the film, you can ask about Gertrude Bell, the making of the film, whatever you wish. And if there aren't any questions, that's fine too. And we have another microphone somewhere. So, any questions? Francis in the back.
Thank you. It was a wonderful film, really terrific. How is she regarded now in Iraq? Is she as invisible there as that book suggested she was in the rest of the world?
Actually, I would say in Iraq, Gertrude Bell is better known than she is outside of Iraq. People still do talk about the lady, Khatun. But one of the things I would say, and there are people here who are from Iraqi backgrounds, she's loved by some, and she's very disliked by others. I mean, people of Kurdish background, maybe even some Shia background. But most people will agree that she thought she was doing what was best for Iraq. And of course, Iraq didn't exist before she came. Iraq is a construct from the vilayats of the three major Ottoman cities. But I don't know if there's anybody here who has, if you'd like to make a comment? No, wait.
I have a question.
Oh, question. I thought you were going to make a comment so people could share.
Can I ask the question? Yeah. To what extent was she involved in drawing the borders for Iraq?
The question is, what extent did she help do the borders of Iraq? Considerably. And she took great pride in it. The one border that was actually later on changed a bit was the border between Arabia and Iraq. And the timing, you might all gather that Arabia hadn't yet been founded, but Ibn Saud was already trying to take over the region, and he would have loved to have had a little bit more of the border. But Sir Percy Cox was perhaps the British administrator who was the most well-regarded of all the British administrators in that region. And he had a meeting with Ibn Saud, and famously, Gertrude Bell was not included. Ibn Saud did not like her. Not many people were that open, but he didn't like the fact that she was a woman and he didn't want her at the meetings. And when they had the meetings and they drew it up, they brought Gertrude Bell's maps, but they changed it a little bit, and they did quite a little bit of the buffer zone, the Kuwait buffer zone and the Saudi other borders, and that was, they said, well, that's going to be complicated. Because that's where there's oil, and that's why they did a buffer zone, because they didn't want to make those decisions then. But she was very involved in the border, and she actually probably was good in some ways because she knew more than most, and she did listen to the tribes to figure out. But as Vanessa said, how do you make a country out of something that's never had a border?
Because I haven't heard anything that she was involved in the border, and basically they just drew a straight line between the French and the British.
So this was the line, the French and the British. She was very much against Sykes-Picot. But she did not follow those lines. Those lines did not contribute to the decision. Other decisions contributed to the lines in terms of when she did some of the lines. The Turkish agreement with the Ottoman Empire, and that was later. It was 2022. So some of that work had been done. Any other questions?
Do you know what Faisal thought about it?
Well, Faisal admired her very much, but he felt that she was trying to influence him too much later on. I mean, he would not have been on the throne without Gertrude Bell. I mean, she can say that she was a kingmaker. And of course, T.E. Lawrence had quite a bit to do with that. But again, T.E. Lawrence never would have had his success if he hadn't used Gertrude Bell's work. Faisal was in a difficult position. He could not just follow what the British wanted, and she was very disappointed. She loved Iraq, but I would say that she was still an imperialist. She still did believe in following British rule, even though she did actually. A.T. Wilson is probably the evil one of this film, in case you hadn't guessed. He and she really had a hard time. When he left Baghdad, they did slightly make up, and then he came again later to the Cairo conference, but at that time he was an oil man, so he was there representing Persia, not Iraq. But Faisal considered her one of his closest confidants and friends. So even when they had clashes, he considered her to be one of his closest advisors, but he just did not want to follow her, without sort of considering other views. I think.
What's the state or fate of the Baghdad Museum?
So one of the things, just so you all can, if you're doing Trivial Pursuits, and she calls it too, we call it the Iraq Museum. You see National Museum of Baghdad, Baghdad Museum, but actually it was called the Iraq Museum. The state of the Iraq Museum it's actually very healthy right now. It still has objects missing. After the 2003 looting, which actually was a deep tragedy, probably never had happened. They could easily have protected it. But there's been a lot of international help working on it. One of the things that the British Institute for the Study of Iraq is involved in, and I particularly am involved in, is the reconstruction of a brand new museum in Basra. And I have to say, felt like I had a Gertrude Bell moments because I was there the night before it opened, and I was working on the case of the coins. Don't tell anybody because I'm not supposed to touch the coins. But so that museum has been recreated, and all you UK taxpayers should be happy that your money is contributing through the Cultural Protection Fund to this work. And it was the British Army, when they left in 2008, that identified a building of Saddam Hussein's, one of his palaces, and that is a new museum. And this year we're working on a library there, which will be a research library for Iraqis and for scholars to use. And the British Institute for the Study of Iraq is giving its library, which was part of its history. We left in '91, but our library right now is at the British Embassy, and it will be given to this library in Iraq. So that's a nice legacy of 2008, not many left. Any other, yeah?
Do you think that the borders might have been drawn differently, and the consequence of the future of the country might be quite different if those oil fields in Mosul had not been discovered?
Well, actually, what's interesting is Kirkuk oil really didn't get founded until 27. There were internal documents. There were a few engineers and a few letters, but it wasn't really public. and actually it was a German engineer who had sort of revealed it to a British engineer who sent it back to the Admiralty. But at the time that this was happening, even though she says oil detestable stuff, which she did mean, Mosul would definitely have not gone to Iraq if oil hadn't been sort of surmised. But they had not yet discovered it fully. But you are correct. Mosul was, and another reason they wanted Mosul is because, or that area is, as you would have guessed from this film, Sunni Iraqis are not the majority. And so by having the north, they would have more Sunnis. I would say the one thing, my personal criticism of Gertrude is that she did align herself too much to the elite, those who had been in power with the Ottomans. And of course, those were the educated people. And she had a few close friends who were Shia landowners or tribesmen. But in general, she wasn't as balanced as she thought she was. And I think that's probably the criticism that I hear from Iraqi friends the most. But she still was better than almost anybody else who was working there. So, which was, she was remarkably persistent in trying to get the Arab government to be the rulers and not to have the British be the rulers. So that's quite, at that time, quite amazing. Any more questions? Or yeah, Caroline, yeah. Ali has your. Yeah.
What language did she speak? What languages did she speak? And you mentioned the elite. Did they speak French between them?
No, she spoke Arabic. Her Arabic was fluent. Her Arabic was amazing. But she spoke mainly to them all. Her Turkish was no longer that good, nor her Persian. But one of, obviously I think she's an incredibly remarkable woman. But when she went to learn Arabic, so I've studied so many years of Arabic, it's appalling. And when she goes to Jerusalem and she does her X number of hours per day and then comes out a month later sort of traveling through the desert speaking Arabic, I have to tell you, it floored me. Luckily, I did read her say once, actually Arabic is hard. That made me feel a little bit better because the fact that she became fluent, and so all these meetings that she would have would be all in Arabic, but she also spoke French and she spoke German, and she had, of course, learned Persian. I mean, her translations of Hafiz are still considered to be one of the best translations ever. In preparing for tonight, I did actually reread quite a few things, and the one thing I totally had forgotten was an email exchange. A previous chairman of the BISI was Harriet Crawford, and her grandfather was somebody called E.B. Brown, who probably was one of the world's greatest experts on Shia Islam and writings and religion, and taught at SOAS almost 100 years ago. And there was somebody was interviewing him, and he said, because Gertrude apparently had been asked to write the definitive work on Shiism, and he said, how dare they, basically? How could she possibly do that? How could she try and understand in her limited time what it's taken scholars, decades? And in here, she says, I've been asked to write this thing. Scholars of Islam, and of course, I should have pointed out, she wasn't religious at all on either side. She was not Christian, she was an atheist. When her brother decided to go into the church, she took him around the world to try and tell him, to dissuade him, but it didn't work. So, anyway. So she was a woman of great mixture. There's one other thing to point out, which this doesn't really talk about, is she was an anti-suffragette. Now, there are so many wonderful books. You need to go to the Gertrude Bell archives at the University of Newcastle website. You can see the books she's written. But I think for a lot of particularly women, we go, how's that possible? But she was a creature of her time, and her stepmother, was a very capable woman and wrote plays, and she was very tied to sort of London intelligentsia. And it's hard for us to remember now, but there were a lot of very bright women who actually didn't like the way the suffragettes were handling things. And I can't quite understand it, but I try to. And they're scholars at the University of Newcastle who work on this whole thing about the women of the Northeast and how this developed. Yep.
Sorry to ask another question. Her first love was in Tehran, right? What contribution, is that why Iraq didn't have al-Muhammara, which is as part of Iran rather than part of Iraq? Keep her love in that side rather than bring it here?
I think by the time she became very involved in Iraq, her love for Tehran was no longer that much part of her life. She was totally riveted by Mesopotamia and that side. Her first love really was just a lovely time in Tehran, visiting her uncle, and she did not actually travel that much in Persia, which was interesting. She then, later on, all her travels were the Levant, Mesopotamia, Turkey, and then Cairo. Yep, another, yep.
I mean, I'm trying to go beyond. The British don't have interest in Iran. They have interest in the remains of Ottoman Empire should they win the war.
No, the reason, okay, so the British interest in Iraq was because of the oil fields of Abadan. Yes, that's what you mean. But I don't think, but again, detestable oil, that she didn't want to be part of that. That wasn't for her. I honestly don't, I mean, that's why she's controversial. People have a lot of different views. I would say that for her, she did see Iraq, or Mesopotamia, because it wasn't Iraq then, as the conduit to India. You have to remember that during this period of time, this was the Indian government. It was not, till the civil administration came and the mandate, this was all ruled from India. And that A.T. Wilson was an Indian civil servant. He was not from, and that was the whole problem with the Cairo Arab Bureau. They were all from London, and she was at one point sent out to India to try and get the two sides to talk to each other because they weren't talking. The intelligence was dire, and she was the conduit between the two sides. So I think I'm talking too much, but one or two more questions, and then I think we should all go and have a glass of wine. So.
Has there been a controversy around her death?
So you mean, did she commit suicide or not? Is that controversy? So this is, I was been waiting for this question because so Ziva thinks she did it willfully. Sabine and I think she was exceedingly run down and tired and careless. She didn't care whether she lived or died, but I don't know whether it was a willful act. Now, it's possible it was willful, and she did not leave a note, or if she left a note, it was destroyed, because, of course, it was a criminal offense to commit suicide. And if Marie, who was her maid, who had been with her for a long period of time, could have been blamed. So if she did it willfully, she wanted to make sure that nobody would be blamed, because they would have gotten in a lot of trouble. Things were pretty bad for her. She didn't feel that the king needed her. Her family's fortunes had gone. She worried about money. I mean, as you saw, she had quite an extravagant lifestyle, and she had to sort of curtail. She hadn't bought a dress for a year and a half. You know, oh my God. Marie made her dresses, I might add, but she didn't buy one. I mean, a lot of her dresses were from Worth. You know, I still find the idea of the crystal in the bathtub in the middle of the desert a little bit odd. Now, the one thing nobody's asked me about, and I'm going to, who's seen Nicole Kidman in Queen? Yes, okay. Don't. but unless you want to see how a wonderful director can do a bomb, it actually really is a dreadful film. And I saw it, there was a small showing here in London when it first came out, and it didn't, at the Berlin Film Festival, people laughed. But it is now on airplanes. If you go on BA to Jordan, you can see it on those flights. So for amusement's sake, you might want to see it. But I can assure you that there's a scene of Gertrude Bell in a bath in a diaphanous nightgown. It's like, sorry, let's try and be serious about Gertrude Bell. So being serious, now should we go from not being serious? And I want to thank, any Harvard Club members who are here, any Emmanuel Society members, and the general public, as well as some of the busy members. They've had opportunities to see this, but thank you all for sharing what I consider to be a fabulous film, and I hope you all did too. Thank you. I don't know if I've been turned off. We're going to put this outside. We did, in this same room 6 years ago, a major international conference on Gertrude Bell, and I was the main organizer of that conference. It's a very hefty tome, but really very interesting, and I recommend it if you feel like spending too much money. I did not publish it.